reality is that only 12 million US out of how much? $7 billion is grant funding. Only 12 million US out of over 6 billion of programmed US funding is grant funding. That is the world that we as Jamaicans, both you on that side and us on this side, have to navigate.
If you're watching Jamaican politics closely, you already know this parliamentary clash is one you don't want to miss. Mark Golding came with serious questions, and Holness fires back, and the tension inside parliament was impossible to ignore. But what does this confrontation really mean for Jamaica? Transparency and accountability? Before we break it all down, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join the conversation, because we're going straight into the moment that got Jamaican talking. Watch the video till the end, and I'll be back with a few comments.
This morning, the Minister of Finance and myself, we met with the heads of the institutions to outline the next steps, align implementation pathways, and prepare for rapid disbursement. Madam Speaker, the message from the IFIs, that is the international financial institutions, could not have been clearer. They told us directly that Jamaica, already the case study of fiscal responsibility for the world, now has the chance to become the poster child for post-disaster recovery and reconstruction. They commended the government for the decision to establish the National Reconstruction and Resilience Authority, NARA, noting that few countries act so quickly to set up a modern, best practice central coordinating body to drive recovery with discipline, transparency, inclusivity, and a long-term vision.
It's really a shame that the international financial community is still approaching the mitigation of the effects of climate-induced disasters on countries like ours by financing packages that are largely based on additional debt. These debts that we are now going to be incurring to finance our attempts at recovery are like lending money to a business that suffered losses through some kind of crisis that is trying to dig itself out of a hole from. Taking on additional debt to do that is going to be a challenging road for any country. Therefore, I don't think it's appropriate to treat these announcements in a triumphant way. We are going to be incurring the costs of paying back this massive additional borrowing in years to come. We are in a country which has spent the last 15 years seeking to get ourselves out of a debt trap, where we've had to run massive primary surpluses every year consistently to reduce our debt to GDP ratio, with a target that's written into our law incidentally by a government from this side, which we were anticipating would have been met this year before Melissa struck us. And now we are facing a new era of massive incremental borrowing. If you look at 3.6 billion US of sovereign debt, that's over 25% of GDP of additional borrowing. That does, and the 662 billion already available, only less than half of that is in a form that's not debt. Most of that is debt as well. This $2.4 billion of private capital, we look forward to seeing whether that will be forthcoming and in what volumes, because you can't project that you're going to receive private investment as part of your recovery. I'm glad that the multilaterals are going to support the effort, but at the end of the day, investors have to be willing and there have to be projects available to them that are bankable and investable. So we will see whether or not that happens. But the reality is that only 12 million US out of how much? $7 billion is grant funding. Only 12 million US out of over 6 billion of programmed US funding is grant funding. That is the world that we as Jamaicans, both you on that side and us on this side, have to navigate. The institution which has been announced to oversee the recovery process, which does not yet exist. It is just an announcement thus far. This National, I think, Resilience and Recovery, or Recovery and Resilience Authority, NARA, is going to, we are told, be responsible for the relief resources being spent in a judicious way, in a way that's efficient, in a way that is accountable and transparent, and in a way that accords with a sensible policy of recovery. After all, the PIOJ has indicated that this financial quarter that we're in now, the economy is going to contract by some 11, I think, to 13% of GDP relative to the same quarter last year. That is a massive contraction. And it's going to further exacerbate the debt to GDP ratio because, of course, the debt to GDP ratio has two components. There's debt and there's GDP. So what we're seeing here is that debt is going to be growing dramatically and GDP is in the process of a free fall as a result of this terrible calamity that has hit us. So while I admire and indeed share optimism about the future, because Jamaica is such a resilient and special country, and we will get through this, I think we should approach an announcement like this with some sobriety. This event has caused us to retrace our steps substantially from the economic path we were on, and which the nation incurred substantial sacrifices to get to where we were. I'm not blaming the government for Melissa. That would be absurd. I'm not blaming the government for seeking resources to fund the recovery. It's going to be necessary to get those resources. I am just making the point that this is not something to celebrate. This is not something to gloat about. This represents a substantial setback for Jamaica, and it represents if it's not administered properly, it could permanently weaken our future prospects and damage the country's future. Which is all the more reason why the composition of this recovery authority is important. I wrote to the Prime Minister on the day after the hurricane to suggest the establishment of a task force with broad-based representation, leaders from the private sector and business community, leaders from the churches, leaders from the NGOs, and representatives from the government and the opposition. The concept of NARA is consistent with that. However, I've heard nothing from the Prime Minister as to the role of the opposition in NARA. We heard it will be broad-based, but there is no inclusivity in the dialogue around how it is to be constituted. The likelihood is that we will not be included in it. That is what I'm hearing from the other side in their responses to me, their sotto voce remarks. All I can say is, Prime Minister, the opposition represents some 400,000 voters who voted for us, 28 constituencies, and our presence in the recovery and our participation in the recovery, you'll be well advised to seek in a genuine. So, Prime Minister, the point I was making is, I think you would be well advised to seek in an authentic way the inclusion of the opposition in the governance arrangements over which these funds will be administered on this recovery, because Jamaica is facing an unprecedented disaster, the scale of which is indeed awesome and frightening to those who have to encounter it on a daily basis in several parishes across the land. So, Prime Minister, I wait to hear your thoughts on this. I have asked you about it for a month now. You haven't indicated to me your views, but I'm putting to you today again what I consider to be the optimal approach to dealing with this particular matter.
His concern is that, yes, you may say that $2 billion is available in private sector loan, but are there the matching investments ready to take it up? And investors. And my answer to that is yes. Because the government of Jamaica was already in the process, because of our public investment appraisal process, where we have to develop projects way in advance. In addition to investors who have been coming to the government to say, we want to do this and we will fund it, and we have to be saying, yes, we understand. If you want to partner with us, you have to understand that we have to keep within our fiscal limits. And therefore, there are projects that are lined up waiting for fiscal space to be executed. So, which is why I've been saying that, yes, it's a disaster, but it has also created an opportunity for us to fund projects that have been on the track waiting to get fiscal space to be operated. So this is what I mean when I say we have opportunities. So this is also a signal, Madam Speaker, to the private sector that if there are projects that have a national impact that can be done using Jamaica's well-established public-private partnership structure, now is the time to get in line for those projects. The leader of the opposition is saying in a sort of a way that we don't have the money. The point is that once the international community stands up and commits to it, it would be very rare or something dramatic negatively would have happened for us not to have access to the funding. I'm saying the private sector money. They have committed an envelope. And once they have committed that, it is then up to us to meet the envelope. And so I'm confident that we will be able to meet the envelope for the private sector funding. How do we, as a small nation, Madam Speaker, stand on our own 2 feet? The leader of the opposition's argument is that we are going to have to borrow to do this recovery. Now, I want to know, hold on, that's what he said. No. The leader of the opposition made the point that we are going to have to borrow to do the recovery. And you have made the exact point. Yes. So what else would we have to do? What else would we have to do? Which shows you the inconsistency of his arguments. But here is the problem now, Madam Speaker. How do we borrow? If it were 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we would not be able to approach the IFIs. We wouldn't even be able to approach the international community. But, Madam Speaker, even if we were able to approach the international community, it would not be on concessionary terms. It would not be in a structured way as this. Madam Speaker, every country borrows. The real issue is, what are the terms on which you borrow? And it is the first time in a long time, in over 50 years, that Jamaica is able to approach the international community and be able to get these loans at concessionary and structured rates. Madam Speaker, I can be clear. I can be clear with the House that our preferred approach is to engage with the international financial institutions, because invariably their terms are much better than private markets, and they support technical development and they engage a structured program. So it is better for Jamaica to engage the financial community in this way. Madam Speaker, we are only able to do this, because we have demonstrated that Jamaica is a good steward with its own resources and a good steward with resources that we have borrowed. That good stewardship, Madam Speaker, the signal of that is that we have been able to consistently reduce our debt to the point where we were almost at 60% of GDP. The international community, looking on at this, says this is a responsible government with which we can partner and lend almost 20 to 30% of its GDP. Now, the question is, as the leader of the opposition points out, we're going to have to borrow all this money. We're going to have to borrow all this money, and it is going to increase our debt to GDP ratio. The answer is yes. The debt to GDP ratio will increase. But what are you going to do with the money? If you don't use the money wisely, then you are stuck with high debt. If you use the money wisely, you can expand your GDP and pay back your debt, and you are in a better position. And that is why, so I'm coming now to the question of NARA, of setting up NARA. So, from a week after the disaster, we anticipated this, and we decided that we would have to establish an entity that will be able to use the funds as quickly as they become available. Because a part of the discussion with the IFIs is that the funds have to be made available at a fairly rapid pace. In other words, it couldn't follow the elongated processes. So we had to establish a new entity, and this entity, to answer the question asked by, I believe it was the leader of the opposition or somebody else, the member from South Manchester, what will be the form? What form will the entity take? This is where we are now in terms of studying the various options available for its structure. Should it take an executive agency form? Should it become a statutory entity? What will the legislation look like? These are questions that are now being studied. We sought the advice and assistance of the World Bank in doing the conceptual note. We are out of that phase, and now the Attorney General's chambers and all the other legal experts are now looking at what legal form it will take. I will reserve my comments because I don't want what I say influence the advice that is given. But we want an entity that is nimble, can move very quickly, that complies with our principles of fairness and transparency and so forth. And we want an entity that is forward-looking. The question is, what role will the opposition play in all of this? Now, during the pandemic, I had the awesome responsibility of using executive powers. And I made it a practice that for every executive order that was given, I brought it to Parliament, though it was not required, and it was debated here, and parliamentarians had an opportunity to vary or change. It worked quite well. And I think we could say that we had the cooperation of the opposition in the management, largely, of the pandemic. When the leader of the opposition and myself met, he expressed to me that he would want to have a role in the recovery, and that was not something that I objected to. I still, however, have to figure out how does that work. The framework of our system is we have a parliament. This is the ultimate forum in which we meet and debate. And I have said, hold on, I've said, listen, let us establish a special committee. It wouldn't be under the strictures of all the other rules of how the standing committees and other committees work. It could meet when it wants and have that robust discussion, ask questions, oversight, and you meet. And it's under the rubric of Parliament. I was a bit disappointed that that effort was rejected in favor of going to the PAAC. But I understand, because it is my view as well, that if you have a government and the government has a structure, why go outside of the structure of government? Allow government to work. On the one hand, you can't reject what I have established based upon your advice and request. We have established it. Then you reject it, and then you come here and say you want to have a role. I mean, make up your mind. I am not here trying to hog up everything and do everything by myself. God knows I would prefer that everything were done in a way where everybody carries some of the weight. But let's not try to make political mileage and gain out of a disaster. Let's not do that. No, the establishment of the NARA, as spotted by the member from South Manchester, has to be within a legal framework. And I have to go figure out now how that legal framework can incorporate a member of the opposition or members of the opposition in how that is administered. No. Hold on, member. There is a precedent which I have been thinking about, but I don't know if it has worked. Again, the member from Manchester South would immediately recall that the National Security Council was established in this way, where a member of the opposition from time to time was invited to sit on the National Security Council. Hold on, man. The Disaster Risk Council is an established position. And we have always said, let us use that, but you won't want to use the Disaster Risk Council. You want me to go now outside of the established structures and set up another structure. That's what you want me to do? No, I am making my point.
The Prime Minister is again misleading the House. We have never objected to the use of the Disaster Risk Management Act and the Disaster Council, Risk Management Council, Disaster Risk Council, as the framework for dealing with disasters. we have perhaps objected to some of the things that happened during the pandemic in terms of the use of orders to create criminal offenses, but that's a different matter. The framework itself is robust and sound. It has been marginalized and put into OPM. And NARA is being established as a new framework. And all I'm saying is, if you want this to be a national effort, it would be a good idea, in my view, to include the opposition in the governance structure of NARA. If it's a statutory body, all you have to do is in the schedule which establishes its composition, include 1 or 2 members appointed by the leader of the opposition. That is standard, it is done. There are many examples in our law of that, many, including things like the Early Childhood Commission and the Parenting Commission. The Disaster Risk Council itself has the leader of the opposition as a member. And there are many, many others. So there's no rocket science to do this. It's just a question of political will and whether you think it's appropriate or not. And clearly you don't.
So again, the attempted clarification has not made the position of the opposition any clearer to me. When we met, I explained that there is the Disaster Risk Management Act, which already incorporates the leader of the opposition. The leader of the opposition went out and said, we want a different management structure, even before I had announced NARA. No, Madam Speaker, I want to be clear. I want to be clear. At the start of my presentation, Madam Speaker, I went to great lengths to explain that the disaster is being managed in 3 different lines of effort. The management of the relief is under ODPEM and the National Disaster Risk Council. The management of recovery is also partially under ODPEM and the National Disaster Risk Council. Some parts of it are privately led, for example, JPS or the telecommunications. They are incorporated. The reconstruction effort, however, by virtue of the time it takes, the funding that has to go to it, is not considered a part of the disaster management, as it were. Because once you go through relief, then you go through recovery, then now you're into reconstruction. And so the reconstruction is a separate phase that has to be managed in a particular way. It has to have not just oversight, but executive functioning. And that's a big difference. Now, before the leader of the opposition attempted to clarify and broke my thoughts, I was about to say that there are some examples of participation of the opposition in advisory functions, not in the executive functions of government. I pointed out the National Security Council for one, the Disaster Risk Council is another, and we could put in place an advisory body, as I had indicated before, of eminent Jamaicans, of members of civil society, and of course members of the opposition, because there will be decisions that have to be made that require strong political and social decisions. So we already factored in our development of how we're going to administer now, that there has to be the inclusion of the opposition. And I want it to be clear that I don't need to be threatened. I just want that to be clear. I am not going to accept any threats about if you know. No, that is not the spirit. No, that's what he said. That's what he said. If you are genuine, if you are serious, then let us, as leaders of the country, let us as leaders talk one-on-one without our conversations. I mean, look, let me be clear. Any lies, any misinformation, we have stood by and we have allowed it. That's fine. Now is a disaster. The consequences of misleading people in a disaster is a disaster in itself. And if you are truly a part of the government, then you must act like a part of the government and be responsible in your pronouncement.
Let's get straight into this, because what happened inside Jamaican's parliament was more than just another political debate. It was a powerful clash between Prime Minister and Holness and opposition leader Mark Golding. And at the center of it all were questions about governance, transparency, disaster recovery, and accountability. Mark Golding came forward with concern about how the government is handling recovery funds and the process National Reconstruction and Reliances Authority. His argument was essential that when major national resources are involved, Jamaicans deserve transparency, proper oversight, and the opportunity for all sides of parliament to have a meaningful voice. And this is where the political temperature started to rise. Mark Golding emphasized that the opposition represents a significant portion of the Jamaicans' electors. So, from this perspective, the government cannot simply operate as true opposition voice do not matter. When billions of dollars and national reconstruction effort are being discussed, the opposition believes security is not an obstacle. It is a part of democracy. But Prime Minister and Holness came back with a very different message. Holness defended his government economic management and pointed to Jamaica's fiscal position as evidence that the country is a strong position that it was in previous year. His argument was that fiscal responsibility has helped Jamaicans access financial under better conditions, and that is the government has established structure through which it should be allowed to function. And then came one of the moments that really caught attention. Always made it clear that he could not accept what he viewed as threats or pressure from the opposition. That response showed just how deep the political tension had become. And this is where we have to step back and ask bigger questions. What should political disagreement look like in a democracy? Because disagreement itself is not the problem. In fact, disagreement is supposed to happen in parliament. The opposition is supposed to question the government. The government is supposed to defend its policies. Ministers are supposed to explain decisions, and parliamentarians are supposed to challenge those decisions when they believe something needs greater scrutiny. The real issue is whether those disagreements ultimately produce better governance for ordinary Jamaicans. And that brings us to the controversial surrounding parliamentary procedure and the role of the Speaker, Juliet Holness. The opposition has raised concern about whether parliamentary producers are allowing enough secrecy and debate, because the Speaker has an important responsibility to maintain order and fairness in the House. Questions surrounding parliamentary procedure naturally become a major part of the political conversation. But here is the bigger picture. Jamaica is facing a serious challenges, and Jamaicans are watching parliament because they want to know whether the elected representatives are actually dealing with the issues affecting their daily lives. People want to know, where is the money going? How will reconstruction be managed? How will overseas the procedure? What safeguards are in place? And most importantly, who will be held accountable if something goes wrong? These are the questions that belong exclusively to one political party. They belong to Jamaican people, and this is why parliamentary accountability matters. At the same time, we also have to acknowledge the governance inside the argument. Running a country required decisions to be made. A government cannot spend every moment responding to political attack or allow every disagreement to bring the administration work to stand still. So, there has to be a balance. The government needs to space to groven, but the opposition needs the space to scrutinize. The government needs to defend its records, but citizens need to answer. And the opposition need to challenge the government. But these challenges should also be based on evidence and constructive alternatives. That is what a healthy democracy should look like. For me, the most important part of this entire confrontation isn't simply who shouted the loudest or who delivered the strongest comeback. The real question is, did the Jamaican people get the answers they deserve? Because at the end of the day, Parliament isn't supposed to be about Holness versus McGolding. It's supposed to be about the people of Jamaica. Whether you're living in Kingston, Montego Bay, St. Anne, Manchester, St. James, or somewhere overseas in the Jamaican diaspora, the decisions being made in Parliament can affect your family, your community, your taxes, public services, and the future of the country. So, when politics clash, Jamaicans should be paying attention not simply to the drama, but to the substance behind argument. What is being produced? What evidence support it? What questions remained unanswered? And what merchandise are available to make sure public money is properly managed? Those are the questions that matters, and I want to hear from you. Do you think McGolding was right to push the government harder on transparency and oversight? Or do you agree with Andrew Holness that the government need to be allowed to groove through established parliamentary structure? Let me know your thought in the comments because this conversation is bigger than political parties. And if you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications. We are going to continue following the major political conversation coming out of Jamaica and breaking them down in a way that gives you the bigger picture. And remember, you don't have to agree with me. Bring your opinion, bring your fact, and let's have the conversation. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.